Well, I appreciate everybody jumping on today. My name is Charles Leitner. I'm the marketing lead here at IntellGRC. And today we're going to be talking about follow the data, CMMC scoping in action. And we have Steven and Mark here to walk you guys through it. So I appreciate everybody jumping on again. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end. And but in the meantime, definitely feel free to put some messages in the chat. We might take some during the session. It's definitely more of an interactive session. So yeah. I'll pass it over to Steven. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, everybody, please, yes, please, feel free to throw in questions as we go. I do prefer these to be more interactive. I call myself a chronic yapper. So I kind of like the feedback. I kind of like discussion. So, I mean, what we're trying to do today in this webinar is kind of go back to the basics a little bit. Mark is a good friend of ours at IntellGRC. He's over at Shellproof. So really quickly, Mark, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'm really excited for this webinar. I think it's an awesome topic. I'm Mark Jackolski, lead CCA, helping defense contractors, medium and small businesses, typically manufacturers and distributors, going through CMMC and building cybersecurity programs.
Thanks, Mark. And I mean, most of you, if you've seen the, other IntelliGRC content, you know me, I'm Steven Molter. I do a lot of the GRC consulting over here. However, I also do a lot of the content creation and management over here. So we're taking more of a heavy marketing role as well. In what I'm doing, I'm trying to take, the experiences that we've had in our consulting side of the house and make it more of a knowledge sharing ecosystem, trying to help, like a lot of other people in the ecosystem are really helping. So that's kind of my heart, my passion. I love teaching. I love helping people think through more challenging scenarios and going back again, what we're doing today, going back to the basics and applying foundational principles for the more complex scenarios and making sure we don't nix them when we're dealing with things like CMMC scoping when it's something more complex or tedious or something like that. So, yep, that's me. And so, I wanted to really quickly just touch on what is our intended outcome for today. And then, Mark, feel free to, hop in with any other goals that you have. But I mean, the primary thing is, it's easy to get lost in the weeds with scoping if you don't, again, take some foundational principles, some found, and not just foundational, but codified, like clearly documented requirements. Some would say not so clear, and I would agree in certain scenarios, but at least the foundational, clearly documented requirements for how things are to be included in scope versus not as in scope, and maybe even touch on some of the other nuances that are a little bit more hidden throughout the text and maybe aren't as plain and talked about as much. So, we want to do scoping in a way that is foundational, and the foundational element of that is data flow. There is no other primary means of considering something in scope versus out of scope. Primarily, there are some nuances there, but primarily other than data flow. So we're going to talk about that. And then, using those principles to come up with a clear scope and help answer some of those questions like, well, does this really need to be in scope or is it not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is going to be somewhat rudimentary. Maybe if you're more familiar with CMMC, you've been working in the industry for a while, those, CCAs out there that are, maybe watching. Some of this will be more rudimentary and more foundational, but we've seen an uptick in even new people coming into the industry. So we wanted to kind of start with some of the basics. Mark, you got anything to add there?
No, yeah, it is rudimentary, but I do find that is obviously one of the most crucial pieces in making sure you have a successful outcome in building your program and building the scope of your environment. And I like to always, before I even start an assessment, is pull up the diagram, the system diagram, data flow diagram, as a way of reminding everyone, what we're talking about before we get
Yeah.
into an assessment. So,
Right. All right. So first things first, we have a couple templates. We kind of wanted this to be not just another webinar that's a recording, you hear talking heads yap at you for, you know, 45 minutes or whatever, and then walk away with really just that, and maybe access to a recording. We kind of wanted you to also maybe walk away with something valuable. So if you scan the QR code, it takes you to a form. There's a password that you'll enter. This password right here, dataflow who dis. And there's some templates that you can use, and we will be using these templates throughout the webinar just to kind of talk through some of the principles. And we just thought maybe this would be helpful. Maybe if you've not had a chance to start working on some of these categorical, documents that are kind of necessary scoping artifacts for your process, or maybe you're trying to help consult others. Maybe you can use this. Maybe this will help you. Maybe this will give you inspiration. So please take advantage of this. I'll leave this up for, let's say, another minute or maybe 30 seconds, and then we'll move on. If for some reason you do need access to it, Charles Leitner did put in the chat a a link to the the form. Now I think actually that the chat might be. I think, Charles, you might have to adjust it to where it's not just
Oh,
going
host
to
and
the
yeah, okay,
panelists.
sorry. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, so you'll just put it in there to everyone. So just be looking at the chat, if you have access to it. And then, if we need to come back here for some reason, feel free to just throw a Q&A or, whatever it is, to let us know. But hopefully these will be helpful, and these will kind of reflect some of the examples and dummy data that we use throughout the webinar to kind of go over some concepts. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on. Charles, you can continue working on getting the link for everybody. And
Yep.
if anybody needs to come back, we can. All right. So again, kind of going back to the basics, which is kind of our goal for this. As I've said, we don't want to try to do CMMC scoping agnostic of uh, the precedent. The precedent being data. It's all about data. The whole point of CMMC is protecting the confidentiality of CUI, certifying the DFAR 7012 requirements, which exist to ensure that controlled technical information and controlled defense information are protected, specifically the confidentiality of that data. So if that's the whole point, then scoping is going to be predicated on the same principles, which is where is the data going, and therefore what needs to be done to protect it, and what things need to be included that are involved in the processing, storing, or handling of that data, and therefore need to have certain requirements implemented to make sure it's protected. So that is a principle that you cannot ignore when dealing with CMMC scoping and preparing for an actual assessment and getting your certification. Because if you do, you're talking into the wind. You're dealing nebulously with totally principally lacked understanding of what's the point of this in the first place. Mark, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think just going through this exercise and starting here better informs the actual business drivers behind, what we're trying to accomplish here. And even oftentimes when we create this diagram, we start to understand these things, we can have better conversations of things like, do we need to print? Is this actually
Mm,
necessary for your business? Or can we remove that?
yeah.
We have a better understanding of how that data moves, then we can have those conversations in a more efficient way.
Yeah, that's a perfect point. We are often very disadvantaged when we don't start with the fundamentals, because starting with the fundamentals do lead to the questions that might actually even shape your business for the better and lead to less overhead and things like that. So 100%, I agree. So what is the data that we're talking about? We've said a couple things here and there, a few times, and the general approach that we're taking today is referring to the protection of CUI, but there are other data types that matter. So let it not be said of us that we ignored other very important categories of data that need to be considered. So the three primary data types, well, there's two primary ones, and then there's a subsequent one that's kind of been snuck in with the finalization of the 32 CFR, which is the regulation for the program. You have FCI, which is federal contract information, and then you have controlled and classified information, or CUI. FCI being the type of data that is involved as part of the performance of your contract, that it's necessary to even do contracting because it's things like your RFPs and obviously there's nuances there, but it's the general type of data that is involved with contracting with the federal government, and this is what's governed under the FAR 52 204-21. And so that there is importance there. There are requirements. That regulation does exist, and there are requirements. That's where the CMMC level 1 requirements come in play. So it is important to protect. We have to do it. It's not meant for public exposure, things like that. But then you have the secondary, not secondary, but this other primary type of data, which is kind of what we're focusing on today, which because CMMC level 2 is kind of the most challenging of the first two levels. Obviously it's the more common that's being talked about because it's more than just the 15 FAR 52 requirements. It's much more, and there's certifications involved depending on the type of CUI and whatnot. So that's where we're going to be focusing on. And you'll see this when we move on. Then you have this other category of data, security protection data, which it's not a governmental classification or anything like that. Neither is COI is not classified or anything like that, but it's another type of data inferred by the principles and specifically called out in the principles of the 32 CFR, and I would argue the CMMC scoping guide, that does have an impact on scoping fundamentally in and of itself. So we're kind of talking about all three of these types of data, but primarily focusing on CUI and security protection data. Because if you're implementing the requirements to protect CUI on the same scope that FCI is also protected, FCI is covered in that sense. Mark, you agree? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, the interesting one here, security protection data, it's definitely been something that's been talked about in the industry, but
Yeah.
it's sort of kind of passed away. And I do think that it's interesting the way that I know IntellGRC's team looks at these types of things. Understanding the flow of security protection data might even open up some more information about, how you architect the diagram and things like that. So it's really, really good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So, and for our MSP friends, it's very important. Please listen up when we're talking about security protection data, because that's most likely what's going to be most applicable to you at the very minimum. All right, so let's move on. All right, so when we're talking about the flow of data in an environment, there are, and we're talking about the 3.1.3 ACL2 3.1.3 requirements from NIST 800-171, which talks about you defining your flow control policies, defining your sources and destinations, et cetera, et cetera. The whole point being under having a proper codified understanding of how is data allowed to flow in your environment. That becomes in most situations, and from my perspective, and I think it's efficient to do it this way, that becomes the baseline for how you know what is in scope versus out of scope. You can't, again, we talked about this earlier, you can't really know what needs to be in scope versus out of scope if you don't know what its relationship to the data that's required to be protected in the first place is. And that goes for all four of the CUI category or the CMMC asset categories. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later. Um, so, so when it comes to helping understand, the relationship between the different categories of data, we do like to do a couple of, exercises from a practical perspective to just gather information to help articulate that. And so actually, if you look at the folder of templates that we provided, there is a spreadsheet in there that it's a template we like to use. It's not necessarily perfect or exhaustive in every sense of the word, but it is a really good starting point. We've found great benefit in using it. I built it a while ago because it's essentially the summation of the most common questions we were asking to kind of determine What is the flow of data? Like what is at least future state authorized, preferable, ideal? What is the flow of data that we want to see? And let's actually make that the only authorized flow of data in the environment, and let that be the predication for everything else that we're about to do. So if you look it's a spreadsheet in there. It's got a couple questions. Um, I think for sake of time, we'll probably not pull it up. But one thing you'll notice on there is there's a series of questions in the columns, and then there is a row. It has a bunch of examples in there already for you, but it has rows where you can kind of jot down with your team, leverage your team, leverage your the expertise on your team and the PMs that work with the actual contracts and know what data they're getting. Um, Kind of list out all the different types of data, especially if you're a DoD contractor with CUI. List out those heavy hitting common types of CUI that you're getting, or maybe types is not the right word. The common examples of CUI that you're getting, things like blueprints, things like SOP documentation, or whatever the case may be. The things that are marked as CUI that you're most commonly, and just generically list out those as an example, and talk through, now that you have that row, that object, the different columns. There's a bunch of different questions in the different columns, like who's the source? Where does this particular type of data, this example of data, normally come from? Is it a prime? Is it directly from a government POC through whatever means? Which is the next question, is how do they get it to you? And work through each of those questions. There's questions about, where is it allowed to go once you've got it? There's questions about how is it destroyed when it's no longer needed? How does it leave your environment if you have a deliverable or anything like that? So let think through that. Okay, we got a hand up. Antonio McAllister. Charles, do we want to allow people to talk and then just mute them after the question?
Sure. I don't think I can do that though.
I can do it. I got you.
Okay.
All right. All right. Let's see. Who had the hand up? It went
Antonio.
down. Antonio, here we go. Antonio, can you hear us? Okay, it looks like you're off mute now. Go ahead. You might have to change your sound settings, your mic and settings in the bottom
Hear me
left.
now?
I
There we
can hear
go.
you.
Yeah, actually, I put my hand up mistakenly, so I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no
Continue.
worries. No worries at all. All right. Let's go back to, there we go. All
One thing,
right.
one thing you'll probably find by going through this exercise and
Yeah.
understanding the data flow, like the security protection data typically is going to be directed towards the technical team, but oftentimes when you're talking about CUI, especially if it's different types of CUI, there might be different phases of the project lifecycle, whether it be sales, procurement, things like that, where you might need to bring multiple department heads. And now you kind of
Yeah.
become like the leader organizing the troops to get an understanding beginning to end how that data moves. So it might not just be one person that's kind of involved in the full
Yes.
process.
100% agree. This is definitely a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
And one thing you'll notice on that template is we're not just providing, examples of CUI, but because again, I think it's very clear in the regulations and in the associated guides that security protection data, as you just said, Mark, is important too. So we also have that as a consideration as well. And we got another hand up. Go ahead.
Hello.
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 Yeah, yeah. Like actually I am Indian. So what do you think this webinar is for me or not? Because I'm not able to understand many terms actually.
Um,
Can can you
well,
repeat the
maybe,
question? I'm sorry.
yeah. Could you repeat that question one more time?
I think I got the gist. So he's Indian and he's trying to figure out how this applies to potentially, where he is.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think what could be helpful is maybe a more one-on-one conversation. That way we could, maybe break it down a little bit more, especially and take it slower because of the language barrier. If that makes sense. Appreciate the question though. Okay, so now that we've kind of got an understanding, if you use that that template or something similar to that, and you're working through the types of data that you have to deal with. Again, security protection data being an example of like technical security relevant data, things like vulnerability scan results, credentials, maybe even technical like technical data that if it were to be compromised, it would really be serious. It itself is not CUI, but it could lead to the compromise of CUI, which is I think the underlying principle of this. You list out all those kind of major elements within your system, and maybe you work with your team to kind of categorize the different types of CUI or examples of CUI that you're getting, and you work through those questions. You're really getting a lot of very helpful information that you could pretty much directly use to then build out your data flow diagram, which is then going to be foundational for your scoping effort. Mark, anything to add there before we move on?
No, no.
Okay. All right. So, wanted to just briefly touch on this. As I mentioned, go ahead and play around with the template and work with your team. And another artifact that we included in that folder, one of the templates that you can maybe leverage if you've not, say, already got your data flow diagram or something like that, is you can use there's an XML a draw.io XML file in there for a data flow diagram template. It gives you kind of like a starting place. Not all of it's going to apply the same way. Um, but it does give you a kind of like a good starting place to maybe play around and see an example of certain language that you might use. And then you can just edit it. Draw.io is a really helpful product. We like using it a lot here. There's a desktop version. There's also just a basic web browser version. And we really enjoy it. It's really easy to use. I like it better even than like Microsoft Visio, which I know a lot of people use for diagramming and things like that for their network and for the data flow. So, yeah, maybe leverage that. And that's the point is you've worked through the questionnaire, and now you're ready to maybe take a stab at building out a data flow diagram using the information that you gathered. And the outcome would be something like this, which I want to get your thoughts on, Mark. We have two diagrams here back to back of example, maybe data flow diagrams that would apply to different people. Now, I really quickly, and then I'll let you jump in here, Mark. For MSPs, there's no 313 requirement for MSPs that aren't going to be storing, processing, or transmitting CUI on behalf of their customers. The only way that would apply is really by you saying we don't do that. We don't have CUI. That is our flow policy. Our sources and destination is equals none kind of thing. You might take that approach in your SSP if you're developing an SSP as an MSP. But we find it really helpful to have a data flow diagram of the relevant data regardless, because that helps with scoping. Again, we're at the end of the day, the goal is proper scoping procedures. And we always think starting with your data flow stuff. So that's why we have an example of an MSP data flow diagram that's specific to security protection data. Mark, what do you think about that? Because I know we had a conversation about this the other day.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole MSP level 2 certification and scoping process to be fascinating, and I think it can be super challenging, especially given what we talked about in terms of the limited guidance that's out there and available for MSPs, because everything's really primarily the driver is CUI, and if you're an MSP that does not handle CUI, the scoping can be definitely a bit squirrely. So I think
Yeah.
just having this diagram even on the screen is helpful just to just wrap your head around where to begin. Um,
Right.
so
Yeah, no, and that's the heart behind it. Like I said, it's not technically required, but because of we don't have a CMMC assessment guide or a scoping guide that's specific to non-CSP cloud service provider external service providers, aka your MSPs or your MSSPs, your staffed, manpower staffed external organizations, right? So like we're not we're kind of left with a little bit of nuance because we know per the 32 CFR that they can go get a voluntary certification. It's right there in the part 170.19 under the table 4, right? So we know it's there. So what's the best inference? Like, what's the inference to the best explanation is, well, we know they can get scope, but they're going to be treated as part of their customer scope. But but the scoping guide mentions this phrase, the portion of their system. Well, what does that mean? What brings a portion of their system into the customer scope? And it's security protection data. And this obviously the services they provide, because that's clear in the scoping guide. So this is what we kind of have as an example diagram for like the types of tools and processes that you might use as a if you're an MSP to handle security protection data on your systems for your customers, things like vulnerability scan results and RMM metadata and things like that, that might be really security relevant. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could be a bad day. And helping them understand, okay, these are definitely the things in my technical stack that I need to make sure I have up to par so that my customers aren't in a bad situation during their assessment. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. I think the part that I personally find challenging is if you're not handling CUI, the scope of your system is really just going to be security protection assets. But the
Right,
security protection assets, if you're using those for your system versus your client system, how do you describe that? How do you show
right,
those differences in a way where it's meaningful for your specific system as an MSP? Um,
right.
so
Yeah, I would love to spend quite a bit of time with people with influence within maybe future revisions of the scoping guidance to help maybe provide better guidance than what we have right now. Because I think you're 100% correct. Because of the lack, we're kind of dealing with inference. We're inferring based on what we know. Um, so yeah, great point. So I mean, we'll be sending out the slide deck to anybody who wants it. So if you want to like take a gander at this, this is just a diagram with some dummy data, best MSP ever LLC. For them. And then the next one we have for a data flow diagram that might be the outcome of that like questionnaire effort that we talked about earlier is maybe more something like this that's more specific to an OSC. Let's call them Optic Federal. I tried to look. I made sure that this was not an actual company. I did Google it, but I made sure. But yeah, so let's say Optic Federal. They've gone through the process and they've answered those questions for the types of the main CUI types that they get from their Prime or something like that. And this is the type of maybe the type of diagram they might come up with just to explain the flow. You're talking about, okay, who's the source? It's my clients, it's my prime, and I have some direct government POCs where I'm the prime or something like that, and they might describe it that way. And then next they're talking about, we have a portal, a secure file portal that say something like DoD safe or something like that, that's provided by the customer, right, by the prime or by that direct government POC as a means to transfer data to me, particularly the CUI I care about. And then maybe I provide a portal for certain prime contractor customers that, they don't have their own portal and, that they want to do large file transfer and stuff like that. So I have my own portal, like a Box Federal or something like that, that can handle something a little bit bigger than maybe the last option, which is my secure email, something like in Microsoft 365 GCC or GCC High that is, okay to be used for CUI or something like that. And I'm not going to go through each point of this, but you can see how you're articulating clearly so that one, remember, all of this is so that you have a solid system security plan that meets the requirements and addresses the requirements per 3.12.4. This is not necessarily to convince an assessor, although if you can write it in a way that accomplishes both ends, let's do that. But you can see how this is meant to be a logical way to articulate at a high level where is CUI going, where is it allowed to go, and that way the reader, the viewer of this diagram, can maybe start to answer questions like, oh, well, that system over there, that server that we have in that data center, it is like a backup location for that data. And we talk about in the data flow diagram, yeah, that's in scope as a CUI asset, or this thing provides, EDR capabilities to a workstation that is regularly being used to manipulate CUI data, whatever the case may be. And you're able to maybe start making fuller decision. We'll talk about that a little bit more explicitly here in a bit. Mark, do you have anything to add for the CUI data point?
No, I was just looking at this diagram as an example. When we're looking at where the data is received, this is mostly technical, but there are some cases where CUI might be mailed and you might get physical
Right.
CUI. Maybe they take that, they scan it, becomes digital. So there could definitely be
Yeah.
cases where, if we have our IT hats on, we take them off for a second and think, hey, there might be other ways that CUI is coming into this environment, but and that sometimes that's physical. So
100%. Yeah, this example here is sheerly an example of a hypothetical situation that doesn't encompass every possible way that CUI could be authorized to flow in somebody's environment. Yeah, totally fair point. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so now we've kind of got an understanding of the flow of data. And again, this is foundational. If you don't have this, scoping is kind of pointless. You don't want to do that unless you know what data has to be protected and where it's going. Um, but now that you have that, now you are kind of set up for maybe some healthier approaches to manipulating a scope and kind of defining that so that you know what needs to be protected. And that is where CMMC does have some really helpful guidance. I'm going to pull it up here in a second, but there is a guide for those who are not as familiar with the formal documentation like the scoping guides. Um, there is a guide available to everyone to review called the CMMC scoping guide for level 2, which again we're focusing on level 2 in this webinar because it's the most common one that people are dealing with, at least that we talk to. But in that scoping guide, it articulates 4 categories of assets. Now, each of these categories of assets, and this is maybe rudimentary again, but it's helpful to start here. Each of these categories of assets are predicated on their relationship either to CUI data itself or to some type of function it provides for security to something that is in scope by nature of their relationship to CUI data. So you see how it still is all data centric, right? You could have things that have nothing to do with CUI data and maybe have a relationship with another asset that provides a security function, which I'll go over here in a minute. And that wouldn't necessarily mean it's in scope because it's not related in some way fundamentally to where the data is allowed to go and be stored, processed, or transmitted. So the first category of data is your run-of-the-mill, straightforward CUI asset. It is the things that store, process, or transmit CUI. That is the definition, the asset description from the CMMC Level 2 scoping guide. There are obligations for every asset category that is in scope, and one of the obligations for all of them include addressing them in an inventory, making sure that how they're handled and treated is found within your SSP. So when you're coming to controls that would apply to a technical asset, you need to talk about how that control is applying to, in general, those assets. So if you have Windows servers versus certain cloud services that you directly manage and manipulate the controls of, or whatever the case may be, you're talking about how you're implementing the requirements across all of your assets, especially CUI assets here in this, based on what we're talking about right now. And then you're required to make sure that they're represented on a diagram. So yes, that is 2 diagrams that are at least kind of minimally important. There's actually no requirement that says you have to have an actual visual diagram for your data flow, but that's like the most common way to satisfy elements of the 3.1.3 requirement. So yeah, you have to have a diagram. And then the final and most important requirement, I would argue, is they need to be prepared to be assessed against CMMC Level 2 security requirements. Just blanket statement. If the requirement can be applied to it, it needs to be applied to it. And you need to be prepared to have that validated by an assessor. And then the assessment requirement is that they are to be assessed against all the level 2 requirements. Um, and Mark, any thoughts on CUI assets? Because that's kind of the most important one. I mean, all of them are important, but that's the most important one to get just out of the way quickly and clearly.
Yeah, I find that CUI assets are typically the easiest. I mean, easy is a relative term, but easiest to identify. But then when you talk about security protection assets and you move your way to the right, that's where the
Right.
challenge really lies, in my opinion. Actually, exactly in this order to the right.
Right. Yeah, I think it would be helpful here. I know that, we got to be conscientious of time. But I think it would be helpful here to share. I'm going to stop sharing um, the slide deck for a minute, and I'm going to share this, the CMMC Level 2 scoping guide really quickly because I think it would be helpful. So here, this document right here is the one I'm referring to. Make sure that this is the right. Yep. All right. Mark, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
All right. So this document right here is the CMMC Level 2 scoping guide. And you guys saw on the slide deck the 4 categories. I'm sure you read it really quickly. There was CUI, SPA, CRMA, and SA, or specialized assets. And one thing to notice about moving on to that second category, the security protection assets, these are the assets that have a fundamental capability, or they exist to provide security functions to other in-scope assets. So if you have an asset and it has a security function being provided to it, definitionally a security protection asset right off the bat. And that's as long as the asset it's providing security functions to is in scope, right? That's the condition. Now, I'm going to argue that the scoping guide later on, I'm not going to go and read through all of it for everybody for sake of time, but I would argue that there's also a nuance here that if it stores, processes, or transmits security protection data, it also is in scope as a security protection asset, at least in some sense, because that data needs to be protected. If it falls into the wrong hands, again, it's a big day. It's a bad day. Vulnerability scans are serious. Vulnerability scan results are serious. What you'll notice is that the OSA requirements for security protection asset is identical. Like the internal requirements, your obligation, if you have a security protection asset within your control, your obligation is to implement all the same requirements. Has to be an inventory, has to be talked about and treated well in your SSP. It has to be documented in a diagram, right? You need to make sure it's represented in your system diagram. And then it needs to be prepared to be assessed against the level 2 security requirements. But where the difference is in how they're treated, it has nothing to do with the internal requirements. It's all about how the assessor is to treat them. The assessor for CUI assets has to be ready to, address all of them. They need to come to the table with the anticipation to make sure that the CUI assets have all the requirements applied to them. Where security protection assets are a little different is that the obligation for the assessor is only to assess those assets, those security protection assets, to assess the requirements on those assets that are relevant to the capabilities they provide. Mark, can you give a couple examples of what we mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, this was something I had talked about before in terms of how this used to be written. It was just blanket
Yes.
statement. There was no relevant to the capables provided, so it made it tricky. But now this is specifically for the capabilities it provides to, for example, a CUI asset. So if we're talking about, say, MFA, we're going to be looking at for example, Duo as it provides MFA capabilities to a CUI asset. And maybe not
Right.
necessarily the MFA access to Duo, but the MFA that it provides to the CUI asset.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
100%.
it's an important distinction because when we're thinking about all these considerations and how to document all this in the SSP, that's going to be the most important from an assessment point of view.
Right. Yeah, the assessor, yeah, exactly. You're thinking of these MFA requirements, or maybe we're talking about the AU family requirements. We talked about that the other day. So you're probably going to scrutinize the SIM a little bit more that you're using when you're dealing with those requirements. But at the end of the day, it's supposed to be relevant to the capabilities they exist to provide, right? Those security functions. Okay, so moving on to the last two, not as common, not as focused on, I'll just be honest, during assessments from an anecdotal perspective. There's the CRMA assets, which are assets that have the potential, right? You're thinking of telos and philosophy. They have the potential to handle store process or transmit CUI, but their intention is not to. They could, but they shouldn't, is kind of the shorthand way of saying that. And they're not required to be separated. It says that here in the scoping guide. They're not required to be in a different spot away, not on a different VLAN with ACLs totally blocking access or whatever from CUI assets. That's not the requirement. And they can still be considered these CRMAs. And what you'll notice, and this is another revision in the new version of this document that we're looking at right now, is again, the requirements internally are exactly the same. Exactly the same. You have to inventory them, make sure they're on your diagram, talk about them in your SSP, and you need to prepare them to be assessed against the CMMC level 2 security requirements. It used to be different. It used to talk about risk-based policies and mitigations and processes to kind of levy the potential for not implementing all the requirements. Just do what you can to kind of mitigate the risks of them having that CUI on them and stuff like that. But that's not the requirement anymore. It is that you actually do have to implement the requirements on them. Now, there's a big difference though when it comes to their assessment requirements. For an assessor, when they're dealing with a contractor risk managed asset, or we call it a CRMA, they are to review the assessment, or the organization seeking assessment or seeking certification in this case. They're to review the SSP and make sure that everything's kosher when it comes to how the CRMA is documented and treated in the policies, and that they have policies and procedures and things like that, to address them. And if there's something fishy, if there's something that raises questions, they're like, that doesn't make sense. That actually increases the likelihood of them having CUI or something fishy like that. Then the assessor does have some grounds to dig a little deeper, as long as it doesn't increase the cost of the assessment, right? So again, this is why CRMAs are not as focused on. They're kind of rare. Maybe there is some better due diligence that should be had for these, but the point is, it's there for that. And then finally, if they can do their limited spot checks. And finally, we have the specialized asset. I see we're at 15 minutes left. They have what's called specialized assets. And these are actually not as rare, but they're still not the focal point of most assessments. These are specialized assets. These are assets that can, again, process, store, transmit CUI, and have direct, technical, logical access to the system, and very well may be authorized and intended to store, process, or transmit CUI, but they can't be fully secured. They can't, the requirements that would apply to a normal, what people would think of as like a normal information system, things like Windows servers or laptops, Linux machines, network devices. They're the things that there's something that is different about them to where it's not really a feasible thing to implement the requirements. So you're thinking of maybe old legacy laboratory equipment that have old operating systems like Windows XP to run a certain piece of the equipment. Or maybe it's something like a government GFE that you have no control over, but it's directly and consistently connecting to your network. Something like that is what is kind of in view here for specialized assets. Now, there is a difference in what the internal obligation for them are. Mark, do you want to go through them?
Yeah, well, I think the interesting to point out about specialized assets is it's not uncommon in a manufacturing facility to see a specialized asset. Basically,
Yes.
what you just described, where you have an XP machine that hooks up to this other testing equipment that is only supported by that testing equipment manufacturer, and you have no way of protecting it
Upgrading
given
it.
the
Yeah.
yeah. So um,
Yeah.
but yeah, you're still required to document the asset in the inventory, document the treatment of that in your SSP, and show how it's managed and your risk-based processes around that asset, even knowing that it might not be able to be fully secured per the
Yep.
requirements.
Yeah, document what you can do and do that.
Right.
And then
Exactly.
yeah, and then make sure it's on your diagram. It's so very similar to the last three, with the exception of you're not required to implement all the requirements. If you can't implement all the requirements, that's what makes it a specialized asset. Now, when it comes to the assessment obligation, the only requirement for the assessor is just to make sure they show up in your SSP. And they're not supposed, even if they see something fishy, technically per this, they don't have the provision like they did under CRMA up here to dig a little deeper. They're just not supposed to deal with that. Which is a little weird. There's code of professional conduct issues and things like that that I would have questions about. But at least the plain reading of the scoping guide is they're not supposed to assess as long as the SSP addresses them. Okay, and then you have out of scope assets. For sake of time, we're just referring to out of scope being things that don't meet any of the previous criteria. They can't be an in scope asset and an out of scope asset at the same time. They need to be logically or physically separated from in scope assets and from the ability, specifically CUI assets. And you just need to be ready to justify that if questions come up about something being out of scope. Sorry to breeze over that. It actually is a bigger deal. Spend a little bit more time thinking about that, but that's the predication there, because I do want to get back to the main slide deck for sake of time. Let me stop sharing. Here I am rushing. Mark, come on. What am I doing here?
It's just too much. It's too much content to
Too much
cover.
content, and I trimmed it back.
Too much value.
Yeah. Okay. So getting back to, so we talked about the different asset categories. Again, remember, now we have the data flow diagram. We understand asset categories. Now we can build our scope. Now we can kind of define our scope. At least I know that's reductionistic, but at least we're kind of well on our way. And so what we kind of do when we have like a hands-on lab kind of approach when we're dealing with like a consulting client, or we're teaching in like a workshop type thing, is we'll say, you have your data flow diagram now. So start with that. Next, a good order of operations is kind of spread out on the table, all of the things that you've got, all the things that are within your purview, all of your assets, right? People, technologies, facilities, maybe even, include data in that just to help you kind of rationalize things better, and start to categorize all your assets against each of the asset categories that we talked about. And what that will do is that'll do a couple things. That'll set your expectations of what's in scope and help you strip away, when you're doing that categories, all the things that don't fit into your scope, that shouldn't be in scope. It's better to start by dumping everything on the table and stripping away than trying to piecemeal a scope together and remember this thing, 6 months into your implementation that you have over in this server room that you totally forgot about and totally needs to be in scope and secured, right? There's no reason to try to piecemeal it that way. You should start with laying everything out on the table, categorize them, and that helps you define your scope, and therefore that's the precedent for building your data flow diagram. And so for our last slide, I know I'm running short on time. For our last slide, I do have an example of maybe a data flow diagram that maybe would be the logical outcome of all these exercises that we've talked through. And Mark, I want to get your thoughts on if there's anything else that you wanted to touch on based on that last, what's a good way to approach building the data flow diagram, and maybe coming up with a well-defined scope beyond what I just mentioned.
Well, I mean, beyond what you mentioned, I would say what you said is really important, that having it all out on the table and seeing a clear picture of everything, regardless of kind of what the category is just yet, it gives you
Yeah.
a clear understanding of like how you can now build the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak.
Yes.
So I do think it's important to start there, because then you actually, like you said, you don't have to think about, oh, I forgot that thing later, and then add it, and then it kind of throws a wrench in your whole process. But I often like to start with understanding, obviously, the CUI assets and what the relationship is to security protection assets as a starting point.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think it's just wise. I think it's just prudent and it's wise and it helps get. I think it's more efficient too, because again, you're dealing with if you don't think about that right now when you're building your scope, 6 months down the road and you're getting ready for your assessment, you realize, oh crap, I have this other thing that I never even thought about. So
Right.
yeah, and just a couple tips for diagramming. Um, I kind of like it's not required to put like the asset categories on the big things you want people's eyes to be attracted to in your diagram, but I do like doing that. Like for example, down here on I don't know if can you guys see my mouse? Can you see the mouse?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, so um I like putting especially your CUI assets and SPA assets, at least calling the main ones out. I mean, there's like you could probably argue that a core switch, depending on how it's being utilized and whatnot. You know, you could probably argue that that's a security protection asset. It probably likely is, but pointing out like the major security protection assets and CUI assets, I think it's helpful. I think it helps you kind of drive the narrative a little bit. But at the end of the day, this is kind of the outcome, and we've used this in our consulting engagements. This is kind of the outcome of some well-founded step-by-step procedures to get through, you know, all the way starting at the data flow intake, you know, form, that spreadsheet that we talked about, those kind of questions, all the way to where we're comfortable with what we consider to be the scope of the assessment and putting it down on paper in a diagram like this.
I,
What are your thoughts?
yeah, I also think that it's helpful to I kind of like what you have here to just put wireless access points and just kind of high level rather than worrying about every individual device first. Because when you,
Yes.
like, I think it just makes things so much easier when you just say Office 365 and the core components rather than getting carried away with like all the individual devices and all
Yes.
the individual systems as a starting
Right.
point.
That's not the intent, right?
Right. Yeah.
The point is to give the reader an understanding of
Yes.
what are we talking about.
Right.
If you don't need a Microsoft Learn document level of every single resource that might be utilized. It's just helpful to point out specific ones so that they're thinking, okay, they are using this in a collaborative sense, like Microsoft 365. They're using it in a collaborative sense. CUI is there. It's being stored in SharePoint. It's being shared in Teams, things like that. Yeah,
It,
100% agree.
yeah, I guess like what are the things that's going to paint a picture and create a narrative for somebody on the outside to quickly take a glance at this and go, okay, I have a general sense of what we're talking about before we get into the assessment.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Okay, well, I mean, I know we breezed through a lot of stuff, and I apologize if there was some deeper questions. And I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer if we need to answer questions. But now is the QA time. If you guys want to reach out to our companies individually, or if you want to touch base with us on like LinkedIn or via email, here's some of our contact information. But this is also if anybody has questions or wants to dig a little bit into something, we have technically 5 minutes. I think, you know, if Charles doesn't bite my head off, I'll stay a little bit longer. Any questions? Let's see here. We can also raise hands and I can take people off of mute. Yeah, that works too. Oh, we got one. Where will the slides be available? Charles, I think we can get the attendee list correct, and then we can
Yep.
just send an
Yeah.
email.
We're going to be sending a follow-up email with the recording and the slides and everything. So, yep.
Dan, appreciate that. It's honorable words coming from you. If nobody knows who Dan Ciarletti is, he's another well-known lead CCA in the industry. Recommend go following him. He has a organization that is doing C3PO assessments, and they're doing great stuff. So appreciate you, Dan. Any other questions? We still have a couple minutes here. Yep, those were answered. Mark, did you have anything else you wanted to chat about?
I mean, we could spend
We
the
could
rest of
chat.
the
We
day.
could chat forever. We could chat forever.
Yeah, for sure.
That MSP scoping conversation that we had the other day was really good.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll do another webinar on that because I feel like that's more of a, what I would like to do is maybe do like a little bit of a, bring some people with different perspectives on it. Maybe have a little bit of a cordial debate or something like that.
no, that'd be cool. I think again, I think the MSP scoping and all that is very fascinating. It's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, little teaser for the viewers if you all want to maybe keep an eye out for maybe another webinar or something, podcast or something like that. No other questions. Wow, you guys are rocking it. Oh, we got one. LinkedIn Dan Cerletti. Yep. Throw Dan in there. All right. Well, Charles, do you have anything you want to add?
No, no, I appreciated the time, everybody. As we talked about, we will be sending out the recordings and the slides and everything. So yeah, look out for that. But thank you everybody for joining today. Hope you have a good rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
Thanks. And Vipav, I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry if I butchered that. If you want to, I mean, we'll be sending out emails to everybody and everything for the follow-up. If you want more, maybe some more context or have a further conversation, happy to do it. I don't want to speak for Charles or Mark, but I'm certainly happy to do it and take some more time.
Yeah, same.
All right, guys. Hey, everybody have a great rest of your week.
Thanks as always.